Welcome to this special edition of the Tyler's Place podcast. I'm your host, Maynard Edwards, 32nd degree KCCH. In the June edition of the podcast, we did an interview with Brother Sean Graystone, 33rd degree Grand Cross, and he is also the superintendent of the building here at the beautiful House of the Temple. And it was probably one of the most in-depth interviews that we've ever done, talking about the construction projects, the restoration projects ongoing here at the House of the Temple. And obviously in the Tyler's Place podcast, we try and keep things moving kind of quick, but it was such an interesting interview and so in-depth, and so many people have such an interest in this glorious building that I thought it would be pretty cool to present the entire interview unedited. So here, that is what this is. You might hear some like a phone ringing in the background or something to that effect, but that is because the interview is largely unedited. I just wanted to put it out there as a conversation between myself and Brother Sean. It was a great chat, and I hope you guys enjoy listening as much as we enjoyed having it. And don't forget, the next episode of the Tyler's Place podcast will come out on the 15th of this month. And also, keep your eyes or ears open, I guess, to be more accurate, for the July 4th special replay on the Tyler's Place podcast of the reading of the Declaration of Independence. Just something we want to share and pass along here. So without further ado, here's myself and Superintendent of the House of the Temple, Brother Sean Graystone, 33rd degree Grand Cross. There's a lot happening here at the House of the Temple. A lot of good things because of some not so good things. So the building, over 100 years old, as we know, and things wear out, things break. But the good news is we've got a lot of repairs happening. And so people who've driven by recently might have seen scaffolding. They might have seen the Facebook feed of a bunch of us up on the roof not long ago. There's a lot going on, and you're the guy responsible for making all that happen and taking this beautiful edifice and turning it into, not only restoring it to its original grandeur, but also making it a living, working office space for 2019, which those two things are not necessarily congruent, but it's your job to make that happen. So give us an update, because it's been a little while since we chatted.
So the activity that's been going on in the back, a lot of people have commented on. We have about, I'd say, 7 stories worth of scaffold suspended over the library roof. Right now, we're dealing with leaking water pans. Anyone who's been to the House of the Temple is probably familiar, and probably all of us equally impressed by the grandeur of the grand staircase itself, which is the pure John Russell Pope entryway design that leads up the grand staircase to the Pike statue and then splits into stairwells that then roll backwards and go further up and bring you to the entrance of the temple room. That ceiling is approximately 70 feet off the landing floor. And those of you who are observant and have been visiting the House of the Temple, and I know this because I get the question, which is what's happening with all the cracking plaster that was at the perimeter of that grand staircase roof. We had a similar situation at the Oculus in the skylight over the temple room some years back. Some of you listeners who've been with us for a long time and know the activities here at the House of the Temple might remember that we had something called plaster blooms come down from the Oculus. The Oculus is the actual skylight space where the lay light is, so that when you're standing in the temple room, you can see the sunlight coming into the ceiling. That has a beautiful motif of Scottish Rite influenced Egyptian art adaptations, right, of the winged Horus figure surrounding the skylight itself. Due to a leak some 20 years ago, getting into the plaster, the water on plaster that old destabilizes it, and you get something called a plaster bloom, where the moisture saturates older plaster, the plaster puffs up, loses its chemical integrity, it no longer has the hardness that a plaster of Paris type material would have, and ends up separating itself from the substrate or the mesh wire that holds it up in place. Well, we had chunks come down from the temple room skylight some years ago, and we had chunks come down from the rotunda ceiling, which of course is not only visually not a good situation, but it's also a dangerous situation when we have so many visitors here at the House of the Temple.
You can't have plaster falling on people's heads.
No, that's to be avoided at all costs.
Negative.
Right. The root of the problem over the grand staircase was we have a very sophisticated water drainage situation at the highest roofs of the House of the Temple. All of the water that results from rainstorms here at the House of the Temple is channeled into interior piping that brings it down through the interior of the building and then out and piped into the sewer system so that we don't have the continual staining of the facing stone, the limestone, being continually discolored by pollution, which gets into the water, and then the water streaks it down, so that some of the black and aging that you see on significant historic structures.
Which is why the double-headed eagles on the corners of the building, they are not gargoyles. A gargoyle would have water flowing through it. Those are grotesques. A lot of people confuse the two, but if they were grotesques, or if they were gargoyles rather, it would leave those black marks all across the building as the water drained down the side of the building.
Right, because in old cathedral building, those were used as scuppers. For those of you who know what a scupper is, which is allows water accumulations at higher roof levels to drain outwards. So that area of what's called the apse roof, because it is it's over the top of the second portion of the bifurcated Guastavino dome that forms that whole roof at that layer. Well, there are two drainage pans that are approximately 4 feet deep and about 100 feet in length that run the perimeter of the rotunda roof. So the water collects on all of the capstones that are over the rotunda, flows down over those, gets caught into a drain pan, and the drain pans then channel the water into pipes, which then go all the way through the 12-story height of the house of the temple, and as I noted earlier, evacuated through the sewage and stormwater systems.
So it's just like the gutter on your house, only it runs through the building instead of on the outside of the building.
And then connects to your sewer system,
Gotcha.
So you never see the water. Those drain pans are very old. They are actually lead-coated copper. The techniques that were used to lay those comes from cathedral building days. As a matter of fact, the last series of repairs that we did on that, we actually brought in French welders who are used to dealing with materials like lead-coated copper sheeting done over a curve, which is on a rolled rotunda. So you can imagine, if I'm explaining this correctly, the difficulty of cutting the individual pieces of lead-coated copper and then seaming them all together so that you have a continuous and beautiful pattern around the entire exterior edge of the drain pans. The drain pans were leaking phenomenally badly. We have removed them. We found rotted materials. We found pools of standing water. This water was penetrating through the layers of the lead-coated copper, through the waterproofing materials that had been laid on top of the stone, into cracks in the stone, and then penetrating all the way through until they were saturating the plaster, which is visible from the grand staircase entry. So to make a very long story short, we had water penetration at an extremely difficult space to access from the interior, which was causing the plaster to deteriorate and then drop from the ceiling in small basketball-sized balls. Again, hazardous and not acceptable, especially for a space that is so distinctly John Russell Pope as you look at it. We engineered the solution, we engineered the scaffolding, we got all the work arranged and bid out by the end of probably February of this year. And we were able to commence as soon as the weather was good. As this repair is done, this is work that we would have undertaken in the grand restoration of the House of the Temple work. So we're actually just taking a little bit of work out of sequence to prevent further material water damage to significant and important architectural detail spaces in the interior of the building. The drain pan repairs should last us, we hope, 25 to 50 years is what we expect. And then as soon as we allow that area to dry out because of the saturation of the plaster materials, we'll then erect a scaffold on the interior of that space of the grand staircase entrance, go up to 70 feet, and then repair the ceilings completely, and then we'll have to redo the paint, the patternings, and everything else that's up on that ceiling.
So this is not unlike what has happened to a lot of Masonic buildings around the country, whereas the fraternity gets rather large. We build a grand building. It's taken care of for some time. Then it starts to need repairs, and well-meaning brothers decide, well, instead of having professionals do it, instead of having it done the right way, we're going to put a Band-Aid on it to save money, to save whatever. And then 25 years later, now the Band-Aid is no longer going to work. They put another Band-Aid on, and next thing you know, now you've got got real and significant issues that are not only unsightly and dangerous, but also extremely costly at this point in time. And it's not anybody's fault, but, it's kind of a pattern that you see in Masonic buildings. And I think any older building across the country, you put a Band-Aid on it as opposed to really taking some drastic action. But you are actually going and taking the drastic action as we prepare in the next couple of years for that massive overhaul to really bring the building up, not only up to safety standards, but also keep it historically accurate. This is not a cheap endeavor.
No, it's not a cheap endeavor. And that was my point here. There are a couple important points to be made here. Number one is, Maynard, if you and I owned a building together, we had an office building in downtown Baltimore, we would have very much the same conditions, right? And we would be making our own decisions in relative values about what we should invest or not invest. For example, in an office building. The House of the Temple, although it houses offices, is not simply an office building. It's one of the most significant historic structures in the contiguous United States, in this portion of the Northern Hemisphere. When I was originally brought on board, one of the goals given to me by the then executive director, Gene Sizemore, and the Grand Commander, Ronald Seal, was, when we finish this project, we don't want to worry about this building for a minimum of 50 years. We are also stewards and custodians, because, Maynard, you and I don't own this building. Every Scottish Rite brother of the southern jurisdiction within the United States, and any Mason within listening distance of this broadcast, understand that the building belongs to them, and we are simply stewards.
We have been entrusted with its care for the time being. It was passed on to us, and it is our job to see to it that it's passed on to the next generation of Scottish Rite Masons and Masons all over the world. So, we need to do it right.
And if we want to fulfill our obligations, we can't pass these items on in the condition in which we receive them. It is actually incumbent upon us to hand off to the next generation something improved. And so therefore, an enormous amount of time and consideration has been put into all of these situations by the restoration of the temple team, because what we're looking for here is not the cheapest price. What we're looking for here is not the most expensive price. What we're looking for here is the best value for the dollar that we can apply to each challenge that we have here in the building, figure out the cleanest pathway through it in such manner that the dollars that we spend, we're getting the biggest bang for our dollar that we can possibly get in longevity, duration, sustainability, responsibility, and everything else. And so none of us on this team take any of these considerations lightly, and we spend an enormous amount of time weighing what is the cleanest, best path forward for the people for whom we hold this building in charge and are the actual custodians of, so that we can deliver to our brethren all across, again, wherever this broadcast is reaching to, the treasures that we should be so carefully shepherding from generation to generation.
Well, and it goes back to our basic Masonic teaching. One of the most basic teachings is every undertaking should have wisdom, strength, and beauty. Those things are labeled as equals. It's not wisdom, strength, or beauty. And I'll tell you a quick story that I know will make you laugh. 5 or 6 years ago in my home lodge, the 4th of July parade went by the lodge, and sometime later that night, someone, probably a teenager, whatever, threw a brick through our front door window, broke the window. It's the first time it's ever happened. It's never happened before, never happened since, just some random event. But we decided to go ahead and take some good action and put a tempered glass thing in there, so the next time somebody throws a brick at it, it'll likely just bounce off. This was not a cheap window. It was a $700 window. Expensive, but was the right thing to do. There certainly were more expensive. We could have gone bulletproof glass. We'd have thought that was a little much. We could have just put a single sheet of glass in there. But one brother stood up and he said, I don't think we should spend the $700. I've got a sheet of plywood in my garage, and we can just paint it white and put it up there, and that'll be fine. And the door won't, you can't throw a brick through plywood. And, there is that mentality of let's just do but we are, as Masons, charged to put wisdom, strength, and beauty on equal stead. And I think that is something that we really need to bear in mind. And I think also, and I know you would share this opinion, that it shoots us in the foot this building is so beautiful naturally that people look at it and go, what do you need money for? This place is perfect. And it looks that way from a distance, but a closer examination reveals that there are things that need to be repaired, and sooner rather than later.
I'm glad you brought that point up. I am privileged with being able to travel to various valleys and jurisdictions all across the United States and present on either the House of the Temple or other Masonic issues. I hear this question all the time. People come in the atrium and go, this is so beautiful. What do you need this large amount of money for? As a result, I put together something called the Horrors of the House of the Temple show, which is about 70 or 80 photographs of deteriorated steel, life safety conditions that are less than desirable, deterioration, the necessity for repair, all of these kinds of things. And I'm glad you say that, because it means that myself and our staff here at the House of the Temple are doing a good job of keeping up the appearances. But I'll just remind everyone here of what the reports written some years back stated, which is the building is substantially unchanged since its erection and completion in substantial completion in 1915. There's been very little work done to it. Every piece of equipment in this building is 20 to 25 years past its rated life expectancy at the time that it was put in, with the exception of the new boiler we installed. And all buildings, whether we were doing an office building in Baltimore or whether we're doing one of the most significant historic structures in the United States, needs to be handled professionally, responsibly, and especially with this, as you and I both know really well, we're standing on a national treasure. And whether that phrase has been taken by Hollywood and used and all the rest of that kind of stuff, this is a national treasure, valued far beyond its use as the headquarters of the southern jurisdiction of Scottish Rite Freemasonry for the United States. Its celebration is, whether recognized by the American Institute of Architects or the Council of Engineers or whomever else, this is a significant historic structure. We are one of the major draws architecturally in the city of Washington, D.C., a city famous for the quality and magnificence of, the federal buildings that surround us. So we not only have a responsibility to our members, our constituency, and our brothers, we have a responsibility to society, because if people from all over the United States come here and see this as the flagship statement or entity of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry for the United States, it had better be one of the most magnificent things we're looking at in the District of Columbia. That's my view. But again, and that's, I believe, the view of the people who take their stewardship of this seriously. But we are all driven to strive as the end of the 32nd degree pushes upon us. Are we content with the knowledge of letting things remain in the status quo? Or are we now in a state of understanding where we know that we are driven to perform at the highest and best capacities that we can? And that takes us right back to the first degree or the third degree, those of us who can best work together, right? And that's the goal here.
You mentioned earlier about improving on things, and I'm going to start a little back in history. Back in, I think it was I want to say it was 1870, but if you held a gun to my head, maybe it was 1871. But Pike wrote a note to Mackey about an issue, and the issue was in early operative lodges, men had to have all of their limbs in order to be accepted into the lodge. Obviously, these are operative masons. These are workmen. So having all of your limbs is going to present, a quality of work issue, especially in a time that was a little less educated as to what people who have had, who've lost a limb or something of that effect, can't walk properly. They can certainly do things now that they weren't able to do 300 years ago. Pike said to Mackey, and I'm obviously this is going to be a horrible paraphrase. He said, as long as you can prove you're a Mason, that doesn't go any longer. If you've lost a limb, if you're unable to walk or what have you, as long as you're of sound mind, you can still be a Mason. And, I think he was being sensitive to the fact that it was post-Civil War in the southern jurisdiction. A lot of men were suffering injuries and things. So the reason I bring that up is that even then, some of our earliest great thinkers were concerned about making sure Freemasonry was accessible to people who had some physical limitations. The House of the Temple is not necessarily the most accessible building in the world, but we see wooden ramps and things going in. And I know that you have plans to try and maintain the historical integrity, of course, but also make this building more accessible. Can you talk a little bit about some of those things that you're working on?
Yes, I will tell you.
I think that's huge.
Yeah, it's also incredibly important, so I'm glad you raised the point. When you're doing historic conservation in the United States, there is a document controlled by the U.S. Department of the Interior, and it's the U.S. Department of the Interior's guides for the rehabilitation and restoration of significant historic spaces. Okay, that is a very, very well-established set of guidelines for how one deals with structures as significant as this. One of the early stages in developing the studies relative to how a building like this should be approached is the performance of something called an historic structures report. And there are specialists all over the United States who do just this. And to make a very long story short, the way this works is you will bring in historic specialists and they will spend a year or two or whatever it is assessing all of the elements of the building. And then the elements of the building are divided, and I'm simplifying this, into three basic classes of historic significance: contributing, significant, contributing, and non-contributing. So let me give you some examples. Significant is pretty much the interior of the executive chamber and the entire temple room. The chairs, the walnut, the fabrics, the light fixtures, the marble flooring, these are all unique items that were custom installed in a space, and they are considered to be significant in their relativity to the statement of the historic significance of the building. Then there's contributing. These are items that contribute heavily to the historic significance, but they may or may not be so unique, and they have a little bit less classification and rigidity of the requirements of their rehabilitation, work, and replacement involved. And then there's the non-contributing spaces. Non-contributing space in the House of the Temple would be the suspended ceilings.
My office, we contribute nothing.
No, that's untrue, actually. The membership office is a significant space filled with unique walnut detailing and all kinds of other details that makes it actually one of the contributing spaces.
Gotcha.
But the significant spaces are the atrium, the temple room, the library,
sure,
that kind of stuff.
The big highlight, the things people snap pictures of when they're here.
Yeah. Once all these classifications have been determined, then the treatment for all these items, the basic rule goes, when we rehabilitate and restore these spaces, the architectural fabric is the single most important thing going here. So on the highly significant spaces, for example, if I have to replace paneling in the Grand Commander's office, which is all French walnut, whose trees were milled out by the 30s or 40s, I cannot go down to the lumberyard, buy a piece of walnut from any place and mill it and stick it back in the wall and try and stain it to match. I actually have to go find a period building that was disassembled and the significant historic materials were stored someplace. We go broker that material. We bring it here. We mill it according to the specifications that we found in the Pope specs. We will mix the stains and varnishes exactly as they were done in 1911 with the formulas that we have here that were provided in papers left by John Russell Pope. And although we will have to have gone behind these highly significant walls to, for example, restore the distribution of the utilities, gas, water, communication wire, electrical wire, all through there. When we put the surfaces back on, the surfaces have to be restored so that you can tell the difference between the day John Russell Pope would have left the building in 1915 looking at this detail and today. I tell you this story, which is probably a little bit longer than it should be, to help emphasize the fact that the maintenance of the continuity of the significance of the historic spaces at the House of the Temple is the single largest factor driving the design parameters that we put into place when we did the construction documents, the permit drawings, the specifications for the project, and everything else, which has all been fully laid out since 2015, and we've been following this track. One of the original goals of the large design and restoration project was to lay out a series of guidelines so that we had continuity and consistency throughout the performance of all of this improvement work, whether it took us 5 years or whether it takes us 25 years. It doesn't much make any difference. So I hope that helps you understand some of the complexity involved in restoring a building as significant as this. We can't just run down to Home Depot or the lumber yard or down to the drywall suppliers and pick up some corner bead. And
we can't put plywood on the front door.
Right. It's not going to work. As a matter of fact, we have custom cast bronze doors that we brought in conservationists, the same people who did the Rotunda Dome, for example, at the Capitol, to come in and restore the original finishes as John Russell Pope left the finishes on that door in 1915. And that takes work. We had to take, just to give another example of the complexity involved in this deal, we took a non-abrasive styrofoam bead. You shoot the door as if you were spray painting it with an air blaster and these special styrofoam beads that will not damage the brass or bronze of the doors, but will take off the black patina that came from 50 years worth of car exhaust that had turned what were originally golden brown doors to pitch black. We know that they were golden brown because we did analysis of the various layers of the patina on the doors itself before we determined what the conservation methods were. Then we stripped the doors down all the way to the cast bronze, and then we restored the finishes in the exact layering and sequence that these finishes were restored when these doors were installed sometime between 1913 and 1915 or 16.
So just figuring that out is a time-consuming, expensive process, let alone actually performing that task.
And then finding the qualified people who can actually perform that work and to still do it in the United States, getting competitive bids for that work, figuring out what the exact limits and specifications for that project are. And so again, this is why we've kept an assembled team of highly skilled, highly qualified experts, architects, conservationists, engineers, and et cetera, all of whom specialize in this type of work, as we have attempted to control our path forward, even though we all know, especially those of us who are either homeowners or business owners and have our own buildings, of what the difficulties of just replacing your water heater after 15 years in your house is. Okay, so that should help with understanding some of the scale here.
And in terms of, though, how do we fit the accessibility features into that? The first part is this, maintain the historic integrity. And then the second part of that is making it so that people, our brothers who can't, my dad, if he's in a wheelchair currently, how does he get into the temple room? That kind of thing.
Currently, right now, we hand carry the wheelchairs up the 3 steps that take you into the temple room. The second goal of the restoration project, obviously, and this is what Maynard's alluding to, is the restoration of the significant architectural features and historic fabric of the building is one thing. But Maynard is exactly right. Building code has changed substantially from 1911 to 1915 to 2019, which is where we are now. You have ADA, you have fire and life safety rules, you have egress and access issues. All of these things were fully designed into the full-scale restoration project. So when we are finished, we will have a fully accessible ADA-compliant entrance entering from the north side on S Street that will bring any visitor to the House of the Temple to the atrium entrance as if they had climbed the 3, 5, 7, and 9 layers of steps that currently lead up to the front door. And they'll be, their first presentation upon entering through the hallways of the House of the Temple will be the reception in the atrium, just like every other significant or not, visitor experiences when they come to the House of the Temple. We are adding 3 elevators. That's one of the more difficult tasks involved here. We're shutting down 1 and adding 3 so that access to all floors at all times will be enabled. There's an architectural feature here at the House of the Temple that not very many people know about, just like they don't know about the fact that the significant and famous Wastavino dome that crowns our temple room is actually a bifurcated dome. It's actually 2 bubbles. Very few people know that. Wastavino didn't build a lot of those. By the very same token, the building is split in levels. If you were to cut a sectional through the building running north and south, center of the building, the front half of the building facing west is actually offset from the back half of the building facing east at the other side of the rotunda by 4 to 6 feet. Which means that we'll change level entries at different floors. So we have multiple layers. Those of you, for example, who've been to the banquet hall in the middle level of the House of the Temple know that the dining room floor is at one level, but the two adjacent hallways to the Burns and International Libraries are 3 to 4 steps up from there. And these transitions take place within the floor, which for a fully ambulatory person in 1915 wasn't a second thought. Mm-hmm. Today, it's another issue entirely. And so we spent quite some time figuring out how to apply the requirements of the ADA access and not violate the historic architectural fabric of the spaces that we are modifying. For example, we're putting one of the new elevators will be from the atrium to the temple room, actual temple room floor. Those of you who visited here know full well that the elevator that accesses the temple room level is actually a total of 6 or 7 steps below the temple room floor itself. You have to go up a preliminary flight of 3 or 4, and then you have to go up another flight of 3 to get into the temple room. So we will put a elevator that goes from the atrium floor to the temple room level floor, again, allowing anyone full and complete access to those spaces. But those elevators will be concealed behind reworked marble entrances that will perfectly match the door frame, headwork, and jamb assemblies that the stone doorways within the House of the Temple evidence. And so when you're done, when looking around the room, just like when they put in the new ADA required entrance to the National Capitol, you can go now into that space and you cannot see the evidence of where the walls were cut, the exterior ramps were added, the extra service elevators were added. It's all concealed behind architectural fabric, which is identical, made of the same materials that were in that room to start with, that have all been reshaped and reforged to make it seamless. And that is our goal here. And so we're doing the best we can to achieve exactly what Maynard's describing, which is the maintenance of the historic fabric of the space and compliance with the most modern codes in building.
Safety, security, accessibility, all that stuff.
And not only that, mechanical, electrical, gas, plumbing, all of it. Again, we are all compliant with modern codes, and yet the sprinkling. Let's not forget that I have to add sprinkling through certain portions of the building to get the proper rating so that we can put as many people as we want on large events in this building as we would like and have perfectly safe conditions. Well, just the installation of the network of sprinkler line going through 100,000 square feet of historic significant space, that in itself should give some sense, again, of some of the difficulties involved in getting all of this retrofit here.
Before I let you go, because you and I, we could nerd out about this until the cows come home. We've talked. I've kept up most of your day, and I think there's a tour group here I'm supposed to talk to somewhere. I got to catch up with them. But I do want to remind everyone the Rebuilding the Temple campaign is constantly ongoing. Look inside your Scottish Rite journal. There are opportunities there. You get things in the mail. Please remember what Sean and I have talked about today. Next time you think, they don't really need the money. Yes, and if you think my $5, $10 doesn't help, it absolutely does. Joining the Acacia Guild helps. There's so many different little ways that you can help. So please take a moment and do that, because this is not my office. This is not Sean's job. This is our House of the Temple. This is our House of the Temple, and it belongs to you as much as it does to any other Scottish Rite Mason.